Alycia Wright taught middle school in the Virginia public schools for over a decade before becoming a homeschooling mother to her four children. She is now the founder of Cultural Roots Homeschool Cooperative, a nonprofit with the mission of creating a liberated educational space for children of color in Richmond, Virginia, that currently serves more than 100 learners. I recently had the chance to meet Alycia in person when I was visiting the Richmond area, and I'm so glad to share her story here. Alycia Wright, welcome to the Liberated Podcast.
Thank you, Carrie. I'm super excited to be here, and I've been waiting to join you.
Oh, I'm so
A big
glad you're here.
admirer.
Oh, thank you. Oh, I'm so glad to have you here and to share your story with others who are really interested in kind of your journey from public school teacher to homeschooling parent to education entrepreneur now with this successful homeschool collaborative that's really at capacity. And now you're really helping other people to launch their own homeschool co-ops and homeschool programs and really try to expand that laterally that way. So it's exciting to hear about the future of the kind of cultural roots and homeschool collaboratives more generally. But I want to start, Alycia, with your backstory of why did you decide to go into education and become a public school teacher in the first place?
Thank you. I found that's a really interesting story because I actually started out in college as a psychology major, and my goal was to be a child psychologist. And so after I graduated from college and had started looking at master's programs for psychology, I got a job at a place here called the Children's Virginia Center for Children. It was basically a residential children's hospital. Um, and I was working with kids in that capacity. Who had suffered just severe trauma. You can imagine they're at a residential psychiatric facility where they live for up to like a year. The Virginia Treatment Center for Children, that's the name of it. I couldn't get the name correctly. And I was there for a while, and it was honestly, it was just too much on my heart. The stories were too traumatic. It was just extremely difficult for me to be in that space with kids who had been through so much. And so I was trying to find, well, what's another way I could still work with kids in a different capacity? And I actually had started hanging out in the school side of the residential treatment center and sitting in the classrooms and sort of trying to help the kids there. And I realized that I enjoyed that space, that was a better space for me. It was an easier space for me. And it was one that naturally I could be my full self and not feel the need to sort of like limit parts of myself because of the just because of how difficult it can be in that type of facility. And so then I pivoted. I went back to school. I ended up getting a master's in education with a emphasis on special education and disability policy. And that's sort of the road
Yeah.
and how it pivoted a little bit.
So then you taught middle school. You said mostly eighth grade students
Mhm.
for most of your career. What was that like in the public schools? What were some of your observations of that experience?
I actually really loved middle school. People love it or they hate it because it's such an interesting age. I actually really love because the kids were old enough to for me to engage in like important conversations for them to understand, but yet young enough to still, be innocent and help mold and shift and shape and just super creative. And so it was just sort of like a really sweet spot for me. And I really enjoyed being in special education and disability policy. And a lot of my work really focused on creating programs around advocacy. This is what it means. Like, what does this title mean, dyslexia? What are some, that does not define you overall. And so I spent a lot of my time at the middle school level teaching content. I taught civics and government and reading, but also teaching advocacy. Here's how you advocate for yourself. Here's how you remind a teacher if they forgot or whatever happened that you get special accommodations in this and that you need them. And really just trying to get kids to own all of their uniqueness, but also to identify what they needed to be successful and to not be afraid to let adults know what they needed to be successful. I
I love
absolutely
that.
loved it.
I love that emphasis on youth empowerment and agency, right? Like that's so
Yes.
crucial. So, you were teaching in public schools, you were a mom of 4. Did you think that you would become a homeschool parent, or how did that, come into your, come into being for you? What was the sort of catalyst for that?
Um, I don't know if I'd given it a whole lot of thought. We had our oldest daughter was approaching kindergarten age. We were trying to figure out what does this look like. My husband worked full time in the corporate world. I worked full time as a teacher. There's not a whole lot of flexibility in either in either space. Teaching at school hours are from here to here. I have to be there. And so we were looking to put her in our neighborhood school. We live in a really great neighborhood. They've got top schools, top scores. Like, we moved there for this reason. I taught in the feeder, like the same neighborhood school were the schools that I taught in, and I knew a lot of the family. So, I really thought it was going to be like this wonderful experience. You go to your school, we can walk you to school in the morning. Um, but it turned out to just be really disheartening. I went into the school to talk to the principal, to meet, just to get some ideas about what it looked like to have a gifted child at coming into kindergarten. Like so many parents, what options might we have? And I felt like the entire conversation was very dismissive. Um, the really interesting thing about this conversation is that my work at the middle school in special ed, I was a department chair, is that I actually did all of the transition work for kids moving from that elementary school into middle, and those same kids moving from middle school into high school. And so I actually had met with this principal several times over multiple years. And I think when I made this appointment, for whatever reason, the principal at the time, I don't think they made the connection that we had met before. And I didn't go in wearing my school jacket and my school, like all I just went in as a mom, a community person. Um, and some of the questions and some of the feedback I received was just, it was very disheartening. So I went in, we'd already had my daughter Alexandra tested at the local university. We'd had, we saw very early on, even in her daycare, that she was an extremely accelerated learner. She was leading the story time in her preschool classes, in the rocking chair for the teacher, and they would let her do it because she enjoyed it so much. Um, and the staff and the principal were saying things like, we have additional services for tutoring. This is before I could even really talk about who we were. We have, you could apply for, free and reduced lunch, all of these different things that I remember thinking, why? What? Yeah, I didn't mention any of this. Like, why is this the verbiage I'm getting? Um, and yeah, it just, and then when I asked a little bit about the diversity of the school, which I knew was not extremely diverse, because again, I lived in the neighborhood. But I found out that, she would have been one of two Black children in the entire kindergarten. And I just remember thinking, or if this is the conversation that's being geared towards me, and I don't even, you don't, she couldn't remember that she remembered me. So that was a little bothersome too. uh, what might this feel like for my daughter? And another interesting thing is that as I was leaving the school and she's walking me out, and I never emphasized who I was. So I realized she didn't remember or make the connection. And I just sort of let that play out because it's a really interesting perspective to gather. As we're walking out down the hallway, several of the other teachers, special ed teachers, were like, "Oh, Mrs. Wright, do we have a meeting today? I forgot. Do we have, who are we talking about?" And I was like, "No, I'm actually here for my daughter Alex." And then to see the light bulb go off in the principal's mind, like, "Oh my goodness!" And it was like a whole personality switch.
Wow.
And she said, "You should have told me. I thought you looked familiar. I thought I recognized you." And I'm just looking like, yeah. But this is really interesting because this is the way you interact. You know, it's just really interesting. You always say if you could sort of pretend to be someone else and walk in their shoes, what might that experience feel like? And I felt like that's exactly what I was able to do.
And, when we talk about institutional racism, this is really what we're talking about. It's these kinds of
Mm.
examples
Yeah.
that, and I hear these, this is not at all uncommon. I hear stories like this all the time. And it's just so unfortunate and so sad. And so, what then happened next for you?
Well, needless to say, we decided not to enroll her in public
Yeah.
school. We actually went to a private Montessori school for a couple of years. until we were on our fourth child. And then, it just became economically not feasible. My husband was like, you're a public school teacher. Yes. And we're spending all this money on tuition for private Montessori. And I said, well, I've been thinking about, what if I just do it myself? Like, I've got this strong background, like I can do this. I had no idea that, public school teaching and homeschool life would look completely different. But yeah, that's how we jumped in. We jumped in because we needed to make a change. Um, and I felt like I could offer them at least as good as what they were getting.
So, what were the kind of early years of homeschooling like, before you created Cultural Roots? What was that experience like for you?
Yes, our first year, people always make the assumption, and Carrie, you've spoken to a lot of people, that because you were an educator, this is going to be like a breeze. They don't feel a lot of times that they have the confidence in themselves to do it, but they feel like if, oh, you're a teacher, you could do it. And I don't necessarily know if it's as helpful. What is helpful is that I have a background in education, so I'm able to pull resources a lot faster than probably most people. I have an idea of what that looks like. I'm able to read the educational language and sort of move in that way. But um, you know, homeschooling is really a family life change. And so those dynamics are things that you kind of have to get used to. So our first year was unfortunately mimicked pretty closely to a school. Like I had our little schedule, I set everything up, I'm doing all the things I've been trained to do. And then I realized pretty quickly, like, wait, this this doesn't need to be this way. Like why am I doing this? It doesn't take me and because I had a child who was very, she loved playing school, as she called it at that time. It was easy, but it wasn't what I wanted our life to look like.
Yeah, and so then, so Alex is your oldest,
Yes.
who is gifted and is currently enrolled in college as a teenager, right? I mean, this was something that was so that the school system sort of dismissed, and you knew very clearly that this was absolutely a gifted child. And of course, the homeschooling process enabled you to really target her education in a powerful way and really reach her full potential. So then she ended up, being admitted into an early college program,
Mhm.
and do you feel like that was really possible only because of homeschooling, or what was that like?
Yes, I really do. I don't think she would have had the opportunities to move at her own pace had she, even if she had remained in the Montessori school, which does a better job of grouping and letting kids sort of lead their own way. But homeschooling really allowed her to personalize things. And by the time she was 14, really, she was about done. I mean, she had already taken all the high school classes, the higher level maths. She did enroll in 1 year of high school at a specialty school here. That was really a really interesting year because even when we enrolled, I said, she's already taken these classes. And they said, well, we can't really give her credit for it because she's so young. And so we said, well, why don't we just let her take the test, the state test?
Yeah.
They let her take all the state tests for all the things. And then she was able to, she passed them all. She got all the high school credits. And so then she started, this is a child who at 14 wrote the local university and got herself an internship in the electrical engineering department. And she spent half of her high school year there with the with the specialty school. They did a whole big write up in the newspaper and everything about it. And then at 14, that summer of 14, she was accepted in a very competitive program. And she was flown to Apple to work for the summer with, 19-year-olds, here she is
Wow.
14. Which is interesting because I have a 14-year-old now who's like, Mom, you won't even let me go here. But Alex got to fly across the country and spend the summer with adults. And I'm trying to remember that. And then while she was away at Apple is when she found out that she'd been admitted into Mary Baldwin, which is I think one of two colleges in the country that has a early um, a early college program for profoundly gifted girls where you literally can move into this dorm at 13, and you take classes. Or it's not like I'm driving her to a community college and picking her up. I mean, she had her bag, she moved in, and now she graduates next month in May on her 19th birthday. With
Incredible.
two bachelor degrees.
Ah, and what's next for her?
It's actually, you know what? We're taking a gap year. We're calling it a year of adulting,
Good. Yeah.
which is the time to just breathe and relax because she's worked super hard. Every summer she's been somewhere. Last summer she spent at John Hopkins doing research, and so we both come to the agreement that she needs a year to learn how to drive a car, get a job, her first job, and to basically build on all of those skills that she would have gotten had she been sort of a traditional teenager, that she
Yeah.
probably didn't get as much because she was in this, you know, more sheltered academic environment. She got some other experiences, but that's another whole conversation.
Ah, just so interesting. So then at what point did you begin to have the idea for Cultural Roots Homeschool Collective?
Yes. Our first year homeschooling, like I said, or maybe our first 3 or 4 months, we sort of mimicked what I had been taught in school. And then when we thought, why are we doing this? Like we're punishing ourselves, creating such a rigid schedule that no one needs to follow. We started, I say we dated a lot. We dated all the homeschool co-ops. We would show up to things, we would just immerse. We just tried to find every homeschool space in our general area to see if we could find something that was a fit. Um, and we found one that worked for proximity, 5 minutes from our house. However, they had some core beliefs that we just weren't in line with. And that was a really hard year because we even thought, okay, well, we can just sort of suck this up and just power through. But it's really hard to be in community people in which you have strong differences just around life. And so then I remember thinking, why not just build it?
Right.
Yeah. And so that was the path we took.
I love that co-op shopping and then realizing that you really can't find exactly what you're looking for, find the people that you fully click with. So take the initiative to build it. And of course, now you're helping other parents do the same thing because you're at capacity with your co-op.
Hmm.
Um, and so as you thought about building it, what was that like for you? Was it intimidating? Was it easy to find others who were like-minded? I guess, what was the early process of building the co-op?
Yeah. I personally didn't feel like it was as hard as I think it sounds, but looking back, I'm sure it was a little bit stressful. But um, I have always taken a philosophy of figuring out what it is I need for my family, and then putting that out there and hoping that people who also found that interesting or cool, or children who were have interest in the same, would sort of gravitate towards it. And that's also what I recommend to people who are interested in starting spaces. I said, don't try to please everybody. Figure out what it is you want for you, what you need for your family, because that's what you're going to be the most passionate about. And the people who are also passionate about that will come to you, right? And that way you're not doing back bends for something you really don't care about or your kids don't really care about. And so we actually started, my daughter wanted to do biology. I wanted a I wanted a something that felt a little bit more serious biology. Like I didn't want coloring sheets or anything. We wanted someone who was actually willing to do dissections, but the kids were young. I think she's like maybe 9 or 10, and so a lot of people were like, "Oh, we don't want to, have them using knives and sharp tools." And I found someone who was willing to do it, teach this class. I opened it up for, a couple of different ages, and people were like, oh my goodness, my kid would love this. Can we come join? Can we do that? And so that's really how I started, by offering classes that were probably a little bit more, I don't know, just free for kids to actually explore, but actually had a lot of meat into them. And so that attracted families who were looking for the same thing.
And so you've described Cultural Roots as a community that nurtures the love of learning and develops a strong cultural and historical awareness in Black and Indigenous children. How has that philosophy evolved? Was that something that you were focused on right from the beginning and that kind of shaped the co-op, or has that evolved over time as more and more families have joined?
It's definitely involved as more families have joined because what we try to create is a very inclusive environment. So in the beginning, most of the families that I reached out to were Black or multiracial families. So two different, a Black parent, a white parent, a multiracial child, and so most of us had wanted, um, you know, cultural things tied around what we had in common. As we became more diverse and we then had families from India and families from Mexico and families who are indigenous to this land here, we needed to find a way to make sure that all of this was being celebrated, right? And so the focus moved solely from African diaspora to just people of color and people of really just people that represent the backgrounds of our families. um, that's really what we focus in. So whatever your background is that you want us to help celebrate or integrate into our studies, whether it's a focus on authors, from the Philippines, or cooking that includes, our Korean grandmamas bringing in her dishes, or our family who's from Senegal talking about, their food and their holidays. We really just try to celebrate the cultures and histories of all the children and all the backgrounds. So
So
it's
you
really moved.
Yeah, and so you started, if I recall, with about 12 families in
Yes.
2016, and now you have over 125 kids. You continue to outgrow the spaces that you're meeting.
Yes.
What is your reaction to that growth in just a few years?
I am amazed. And I am actively looking for support in this area. So if anyone's listening to this and this is your specialty, come talk to me because we have such a need. And we have a small board with mostly dedicated parents and people in the community who appreciate our work. But the fact that we've outgrown our community center, which is a large community center, with several rooms. Um, and we still have people who are saying, can we, how do we get our children? How do we be a part? How do we grow? There's a solid number of families who are interested in a more traditional Monday through Friday micro school experience.
Mm.
In addition to our cooperative experience, we have another group called Friends of the Co-op who they really are interested in, all the social activities, the webinar parents. We do lots of parent support. um, we have like standing lesson planning meetings for anyone to join on the Zoom. And we have from unschoolers all the way up to very, what I would say, A type planners. Um, and then the gamut, but we all still come together because we all still want, our children just to thrive and have access. And so, yeah, I'm not really sure. We are building out a second site this summer, a forest school. We are located in a very urban area, and we are surrounded by woods and a forest, but we like to get the kids in a more rural space, and invite families because our plan is to really teach, um, specifically around agriculture and growing your own food and living off the land and medicinal science with herbs, and to move in that direction. But you know what? I'm gonna be, like I said, in San Diego because now I've been introduced to this whole metaverse and DAOs. And so now my brain is like, oh my goodness, how do I like incorporate this? Because we have families also who want to do more online classes. So we're just trying to figure out how to do all the things and not run off the railroad.
Oh, it's so exciting. It's such an exciting time. I'm looking forward to seeing you again in person next week at ASU GSV
Yeah.
conference talking about alternative education and different sorts of innovative models. You mentioned your friends of the co-op, who are people you're just at capacity with the co-op, and so there's other people who either want to be involved or at least want to be a part of the social activities. And I think you told me you had about 80 kids that are in the Friends of the Co-op program.
Yeah.
You go to field trips and special events. The day that I met with you in Richmond, you had gone to Alice in Wonderland at the local
Yes.
theater downtown. So just such a vibrant homeschooling experience in the greater Richmond area. And like you said, you're kind of outgrowing this large community center now. You're thinking maybe you need a vacant school building or an industrial building or something that's going to,
Yes.
hold all of you for when you meet and bring in educators in the community. You have some really high quality instructors for various classes. And the students in the co-op are also really involved in helping to decide what classes are included. Is that right?
That's right. So at the end of each year, the students do twice a year, the students offer feedback on their classes and their teachers, which is really interesting, right? A really interesting model. I wish I could have given feedback when I was a student on my teachers in class. And actually, as a teacher, I would have found that really helpful to have someone, anonymously, right, give me feedback on what they thought of my class and what I could do to improve. And so the students submit that twice a year. And then at the end of the year, they rank their classes, and they also have space to talk about what new things they'd like to see and what things they never want to see again. Thankfully, we don't have much of that, but sometimes people, if you said, "Hey, I'm going to try this coding class," and you realize, you know, after your parent already sort of supported you in this coding class, coding is, a headache. I never want to do that again. That's a great lesson. I tell people all the time, especially young people, I feel like it's even more helpful sometimes to know what you don't like. Know what you
Right.
do not enjoy doing, because that there's nothing worse than doing something that you hate doing. Um, and then that automatically helps you figure out what you do like.
So the co-op meets part-time. Is it 2 days a week?
Yeah, well, it's 3 days for our high school, which we've built out this year. They meet 3 days a week. Currently, the K through 8 meets 2 days a week, Mondays and Wednesdays from 10 to 2. Really, it's more like 10 to 3:30. That's because that's what time we actually end up leaving. And then on Fridays are often experiential learning. So we're out in the community trying to do things. Um, Next year, we are going to move to 3 days a week, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. So I see this evolution happening, right?
Yeah, and that's where you talked about even some families interested in a micro school, a more full-time schooling alternative up to 5 days a week. Do you think that that would be under the Cultural Roots umbrella, or is this part of your work in helping to inspire other parents to create their own models?
Yeah, well, I think I do believe the high school will eventually become, and because it really does look like a micro school now. Their schedules are a little bit more set, and it looks a little bit more like community college, right? Because this is what I needed for my own child. So this is how we were building it. Um, and so I do foresee that eventually moving into a larger sort of separate thing. Um, I am right now, we have families who drive over an hour to get to us,
Wow.
from Charlottesville. So that's a UVA area, which is about an hour. And we have families a little bit, southward doing the same thing, just from a different direction. And so I've really been talking to them about, what would it look like to build community there? And how can I help you?
Mm,
Because if we're trying to build community, it's a harder for you to commute, 2 days a week, and then when there's a sporadic field trip or something else, it just becomes much more difficult. And then there's a vibrant community down in that UVA area, right? You've got a wonderful college there, you've got a growing number of homeschoolers, and the same thing we have at South, which is Petersburg, Virginia, um, where there's a growing number of homeschoolers there. So I'm trying to convince some families, well, not even convinced. I think they are very much interested. I think it's just a little bit of hesitation. Um, I think for some families, it's hard to leave our space to create a new space. So that's sort of where we are, trying to
amazing.
encourage families to create new spaces in their own communities.
So, does that leave you optimistic for the future of alternative education and these kind of innovative learning models, community-based learning models? Like, what is your sense of where this whole movement is going over the next 5 to 10 years?
Oh my goodness, I really feel like there's so many different, legs. I think one thing is for sure, when parents got a taste of this freedom during COVID, a lot of them are not going back. A lot of them realized they weren't satisfied. They felt as if their children could experience better, and that they could find resources to provide it. I think There's several different legs here, though. I think there's a whole online world that did work well for for a lot of kids. Um, and I think that, and this whole idea of decentralized schools and education is a huge thing that's going to be coming up. And I'm trying to figure out, how do we also make sure that we offer that to some of our families who are interested. I do think there's always a desire for in person because the synergy and energy you get from being in physical community with people, um, it's unlike virtual. You can get a lot of the same things like the communication, but there is something about physically being in community with people, physically touching and embracing people. Um, that, and then I feel like just as much as there's this push to utilize technology to its fullest, there's also a push to get kids um, from being too consumed by technology and back into nature, right?
Mhm.
So you have these two worlds, and then you've got this third one in the middle. And so I'm really excited to see sort of where these three things go, where this push back to nature goes, this, technology and the consumption of technology really does require your brain for the good, in many ways, which can be beneficial, but can also have some harmful effects if kids aren't guided and helped along the way. And there's been numerous studies about that with the teenage brain in particular. But then there's wonderful things coming with like Chat GPT and this whole metaverse, and we know that that's going to be a part of our future. So Carrie, I'm like you and like everybody else. I'm trying to be a part of this movement, but I'm also watching it to see
Mm.
where the kids are leaning in and just trying to observe what's working.
And how do you think that this alternative education system or these learning models like yours that are clearly in high demand, how do you think that they will impact, or do you think they'll impact the conventional school system for the better? I guess, where do you see more traditional schooling going in the future as someone who was in that model for over 10 years as a teacher?
Well, I can tell you what, when COVID happened, I had two school districts reach out to me about, we know nothing about home education. We know nothing, this is what they're saying. We know nothing about this world. You're in this world. And
Wow.
because we had moved our classes outdoors, we never stopped meeting. And I think because we were still on social media, people could see, hey, wait a second, you guys are saying you can't do this, but I see people out there doing this. And we also moved some of our classes online before the pandemic, just because we could. It wasn't
Mhm.
COVID hit. We were just always there. And so I had school districts saying, how much time do you recommend students stay online? How do breakout rooms work? How do you guys facilitate this? How do you facilitate that? So I know that they were looking and trying. I just think it's interesting that the public schools, some of the districts were turning to homeschoolers
That's great.
to help
Yeah.
figure it out because it wasn't their space, but they understood they had to do something different and they didn't have a lot of time to do it. And I was very happy to help.
Yeah, that is such an interesting story. And so maybe there will be that continued influence on the traditional system and looking at some of these out of system models to get some ideas and potentially incorporate some of the innovations that you're doing. So, Alycia, as we wrap up, I'd love to hear your advice for other parents or educators who may be listening, who are thinking about wanting to start a homeschool co-op or a micro school in their own communities. What advice would you say for them to get started?
If you're an ordinary mom and dad or parent, um, I just say just start. Really, even if it's just you and one other family getting together to do something, I would share that as much as possible because by sharing your experiences, even in social media, it allows others to see. And you never know who you might be inspiring, and you never know who you might attract, and you never know what partners you might attract who might say, "That's kind of cool. Yeah, it's a small group of three families, but you know what? I'm going to go and lend my resources to help them. I'm going to go and teach an art class. I'm going to go and do that." We've been really lucky that we've been able to really tap into community partnerships. I mean, I don't even know how this has happened, but but we have, because they see what we're doing, and it's not like we started out trying to build this huge thing. We were just being ourselves. We were just doing the things that we wanted to do, that our children wanted to do. And I think that excitement translates and others get excited by watching. And so my advice is not to worry about oh my goodness, I've got to find a center. I've got to get insurance. I've got to do all these things, but just start small. Start renting a library room, start at a local park, rent the shelter. And then just as you grow, you'll learn and you'll build and hopefully you'll tap into people. I'm more than happy to help guide people. I do talks all the time, but tap into mentors who are further along and learn from them and watch and follow.
And then
That's
who knows, maybe a few years in, they'll have those similar challenges that you now have of how to find a
yes.
space big enough to support all of you. That's just so exciting. So, Alicia, if my listeners and viewers want to connect with you and learn more about Cultural Roots Homeschool Cooperative, what is the best way for them to do that?
We have a website. It's culturalrootscoop.com. The co-op has a hyphen in between. And so check out the website. I think just to see who we are and what we're doing, I feel like our social media is probably the best place for that. And on Instagram, it's Cultural Roots Homeschool, like all one word. You can find me personally at Homeschool Life INVA, Homeschool Life in VA. Um, and then I guess, Carrie, I'll just give you a plethora of links and things that you can attach to this.
That sounds great. Wonderful. Alycia Wright, thank you so much for being on the Liberated podcast. And I look forward to seeing you again in person next week in San Diego.
I can't wait. All right, everybody, go out there and be great.